Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar, Least Privilege 2.0, Controlling Risk in a Dynamic Environment. My name is Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director for the Security Solutions here at Appsian, and I'd like to thank you for joining us on the webinar. Just some brief intros and how we're going to work the webinar today. There is a GoToWebinar control panel that is normally on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit any questions that you have during the session today via that GoToWebinar control panel. We'll make sure all of those get answered during the session or at the end. Also, if you have questions that you want to follow up, you can always email us at info@appsian.com. So with that, just a brief intro of what we wanted to talk about. So when we think about Least Privilege 2.0 and what's going on in the environment today, it really is about ERP risks and how to manage those risks and what we're doing with those. So the risks have really evolved, and it's time that we take a moment to reconsider the approach to mitigating these risks is really what we're going to be talking about today. Least privileged has always been a guiding principle in security, and what that is technically, the user is going to access the system with the least amount of privileges and access as they can, so that everything else is going to be as secure as possible. So, the problem is there's many ways that you can enforce this, and it must be adapted at times. So in this session, some of the things that we are going to explore is how organizations can minimize their risk exposure in today's dynamic environment while all being enabling flexible, user-friendly access. So some quick introductions from our side. As I said earlier, my name's Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here. I've been working with ERP solutions since really the late 90s. I've been with Appsian coming up here in May will be 7 years. So quite a long time now. Before that, I worked in higher ed, retail, and oil and gas, basically as an enterprise architect through most of my career. I'm also joined by Rajesh, who's our VP of SAP Engineering. Rajesh, why don't you do a brief intro of yourself real quick?
Sure, Greg. Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Rajesh Rangaratnam. Been working on SAP products and solutions over the last 23 years and have been working on SAP product development for the last 10 plus years and have headed the development of a couple of solution extensions for SAP GRC access control and have been with Appsian for 3+ years now. I'm very happy to be sharing the Appsian solution with you all today.
Thank you, Rajesh. And you're definitely going to hear more from Rajesh later in the sessions. He's going to come in and demo the solution for you today as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a brief introduction of who we are as a company, and then we're going to get into the topic today. So what we do here at Appsian is we're going to protect the foundation of your business, and we're going to enable that with is we're going to protect the SAP data and transactions that make it all possible. So when you think about our Appsian data security platform, it's a multi-pronged approach. We've got data-centric security and also real-time analytics. Those two things are paired together to be able to provide you a cohesive solution that you're going to find out more about today as well. We were founded in 2012. We've got over 250 plus customers worldwide, and we do ERP security for a couple of different ERP vendors, so SAP, Oracle EBS, and PeopleSoft. We are an SAP certified solution and partner. So that's an important thing to call out, just as well as we're an Oracle partner as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the content today. What I wanted to start with is defining the principle of least privileged. What do we currently mean by that? What's the accepted definition? So when we think about least privileged, it really states that the subject should be given only those privileges needed to complete its task. So if the subject does not need access to the right, the subject should not have that right. Furthermore, the function of that subject, as opposed to its identity, should control the assignments of its rights. So it's really all about controlling risk. And if we think about, security in general, that's exactly what security is what types of controls can we put in place to protect the system with a sufficient amount of risk. So Less access means the improper use of privilege are less likely to occur, which is really a large challenge inside a lot of the ERP systems. Is privilege controls and privileged abuse are really a large challenge. One, to track, two, to understand, and three, really to work with inside of the system. Because traditionally, when we think about how least privileged has been applied to SAP, one, it's going to start with role design and security policies. So you're going to have the role-based access controls that are really built around the functional requirements. This particular user needs access to this particular function, and they need to be able to do that for their job. Whether we're talking about a payroll clerk, an AP clerk, somebody doing accounts receivable, whatever their job function is going to be, that's really what the role is designed around, is to give them access to the data and the transactions required to be able to produce and do their job or that function. So it's difficult when you start layering a lot of these roles to really enforce a least privilege. And that's one of the drivers of segregation of duties, is because it's enforced via roles in that role-based access control. And what it's hoping to do, and I say hoping is because it's sometimes very difficult to control this, is it's going to prevent conflicts of interest as well, which can change over time inside of an organization as to what somebody's doing, because their roles and their job is going to change as well. So segregation of duties can become a very large challenge to do in an effective way. And there's typically a lot of manual reporting and back-end work that has to be done to make sure that something didn't happen that's going to cause an SOD style violation. So is this approach really sufficient? If we think about the last, 12 to 14 months, inside of the business environment, how things have really changed. Business is far more dynamic and mobile than it used to be, and really from the hackers, they've decided that attacking the organization itself can become a really large challenge. I'm not saying that they don't attack the organization as itself, but user-centric threats are definitely rising. They're specifically targeting users, going after their credentials, going after how they work with the system. So those targeted attacks at those specific users are definitely increasing, and the compliance requirements are expanding. When we think about compliance, a lot of it might be based upon the privacy laws for effect, GDPR, and SOD and financial reporting still goes back to Sarbanes-Oxley. There's numerous states that are coming up with different privacy laws, as well as dozens of countries that have different privacy laws in effect now of who should be able to see data if this person resides within this country. It's a big challenge for the EU, even though they're all kind of under the same governing body. They don't necessarily want data leaving some of the individual member states to be seen by other other parts of the organization outside of that member state. So can definitely become a challenge. And the way we access SAP has changed dramatically over the last decade. But really, we can even pinpoint the last, like I was saying earlier, 12 to 14 months. Has been a dynamic shift of how people are accessing systems holistically, regardless whether they're ERP or just any of the business systems that you're currently working with. When we start thinking about what and how the controls are put in place today, really those role-based access controls are very static. So what they're doing is leaving risks unaddressed, and by that, risk is dynamic. It's going to continue to change. The way people access your system, the way it's going to be utilized, the data that it's going to store, the privacy laws that are going to come into effect, people all of a sudden working from home and remote and all of those types of scenarios. All of those things are drastically changing, and those are all different risks. They're all going to affect your footprint, how your organization is running, how they're going to control access to these systems. So as the risk continues to change, static controls without context really only limit the coverage that you can protect. It's going to constrain the least privileged enforcement. It's going to stipulate a detective versus preventative approach. And that's one of the things that, most organizations nowadays, I'm not going to say most, but, organizations struggle with moving between becoming detective versus proactive or preventative. And that's really a dynamic shift inside of their footprint and their architecture and how they look at protecting their organization as a whole. And with these, these static controls really are going to increase the level of accepted risk, because from an organizational perspective, there's only going to be so much you're going to be able to do to protect. And really, it's about that granularity. If you can't get down into the granular level of protecting these applications, there's only so much that static protections are going to be able to do for you, which really leads into the definition of implicit data protection. And it's really no longer enough. When we go back to those role-based access controls, they stop at the transactional level. They're not going to limit the data inside of that particular transaction. The user's going to get access to the transaction. They're going to be able to do this decode. They're going to be able to access the data within there. That's the way the system was designed. That's the way ERP in general works. They're large data stores, and what they do is they make sure that you have consistent business processes across your organization, and they're able to share information to and from all of these different business processes because of the way the ERP system works. That's the design. That's what we're going after. We want to be able to do things better, faster, and smarter. It's why we implemented these things in the first place. So, they're designed to process very large amounts of data. It's not necessarily designed to control the detail level of who can see which particular data element inside of a T code, for example. So that limited protection within the transactions really becomes an exposure for you as well, because it does expose that data when it's unnecessary. The toggling on and off of data masking, those types of things, lacking that granularity to efficiently report on the data access itself. That's one of the reasons why when we look at this from a solution point of view, we have a two-pronged approach. One is to be able to understand what the user is doing and accessing, but also the access controls to put into place. Because it's a multi-pronged solution there. So these gaps really lead to a variety of risks. Number one, all organizations are concerned about data exfiltration. Any sort of data that leaves their organization should be a concern for them. And now as more remote access is taking place, some of the organizations are moving back into the office, some aren't. We've actually seen some spikes where some areas of the world are actually going back into some lockdowns where they were attempting to get people back into the office. And so we still have a lot of people working from home. And when we think about malicious actors, their goal is to steal company data. It could be private, it could be personal, it could be information about that organization itself, and from a competitive business perspective as to how can I, compete against this particular organization, or how can I steal their secrets, whether that happens to be, manufacturing or some sort of recipe on what they make, for example. So, leaking of data via downloads to a personal device, exporting data on an untrusted network after hours, all of those things increase risk. When we talk about fraud and theft, modifying GL accounts and posting to it, manipulating bank account details before a payment run. This is something that we've, heard from, hundreds of customers and non-customers, that it's a very large challenge, and honestly still today is creating and paying fake vendors. It's something that when you have these, employees that have access inside of the system, there's still going to be challenges. That comes down to a separation of duty violation, and when you're looking at things, not in an automated fashion, or if you're having to, look back in a manual way, it becomes very difficult to catch 100% of all of these things. Compliance risks are definitely something that's going to continue to be a challenge. Really, it's about exposure of information that shouldn't be exposed, which is really kind of what we're talking about with least privileged altogether. Somebody viewing data that they really don't need at that particular point in time within the transaction. When it changes your compliance and how you need to be able to respond to the access of this information, and what are you going to do to track all of that from a sensitive information or just business risk in general. And then also policy violations. You've often have policy goals and objectives. So, what are your policies and procedures that you have defined as an organization, and how do you, automate those to be within the system, to where people can't give too much of a discount, where they can't release purchase orders above a certain amount, where there are unauthorized changes to a production run, those types of things. They can't do those policies, can't actually make those changes. And that's what we're talking about with policy validations, is really how do you ensure that your policies and procedures are also being followed correctly inside of the systems. So when we talk about the evolving SAP security with least privilege 2.0. What I want to do is really talk about that from the aspect of what is 2.0, why is it different than what least privilege started with, and why should you really want to leverage and implement it. So when you talk about least privilege 2.0, it's really about how evolving how we address the risks in SAP. So we've seen the digital transformation. It's gone across organizations, applications, processes, the user experience. But one of the things that we haven't necessarily seen is the transformation of security, the change on how people are utilizing the data, the transactions within these applications. The applications themselves are typically the same thing as what they were before. So it's just going to allow those users to do whatever they've been defined to do within their roles. So one of the things that we need to account for, especially with least privileged, is context, because context can help you determine risk. And when you can help determine the risk, that's how you can then control your risk at a better level. Ultimately, kind of what we talked about earlier is risk, specifically security is about managing risk. And what we want to do is leverage technology to be able to mitigate this risk. That's the goal. And so if we can bring into effect the context, and that's going to give us more information about how that user might be using our system. And now what we want to do with that user. Should we trust them explicitly, or should we not trust them explicitly? So that's really what we're talking about with bringing in that additional context. So we're leveraging new age controls to advance the SAP security model is really what's going to happen. So we can get into fine-grained data protection. Does the user need to see that particular piece of information? They're within that T code. Do they need to see maybe a national ID, sensitive information? All of those things could be defined. All of those things can be built and protected, to have those dynamic access controls. So, and by that dynamic, what we mean by that is really based upon how the user is accessing the system, what should or should they not be able to do? So first off, we're going to look at maybe a user accessing the system remotely, for example. In a remote situation, what data should they really be able to work with? So that's where these things are layered together, and we're taking that context into effect. And that's really going to drive risk-aware process controls. Because if we understand the risk and we're aware of that, then we can control the access in a way that's going to mitigate much of the risk. So is this a violation of business policy? It goes back to some of the policies that we were talking about earlier. So that's the end game of really least privilege 2.0, is bringing in that context to give you the understanding of what's happening, to understand how the user is accessing your system and what should or should they not be able to work with based upon your own policies, and define those and build that within the security model. So when we achieve that real-time risk mitigation, it's by considering the context of the user access. So when we go back to our platform, the Appsian security platform, it's going to natively integrate with SAP. That's key. It's important. So it's going to allow you to work within the tools that you're already used to, and it's going to enable a policy-based access control, which provides that field level data protection and delivers granular actionable insights. So that's where we go back to that multi-pronged approach. You've got to have the understanding of what the users have done and what they have accessed to really be able to affect your security model. So a lot of times what we'll find is organizations are going to mature. If you think about GDPR, privacy laws, what's going to happen? You need to sit and understand where you're at today and what you need to do better before you can improve, right? It's all about a model. It's a life cycle. So what we're doing here is giving you the tools to be able to do that. So through real-time analytics, you're going to be able to mature your security models to refine exactly what data people should and shouldn't be able to work with. So really gives you the controls to mitigate those risks and extend your security model. And it allows you to balance business and security requirements, because what the platform does is it's going to take multiple inputs, policy-based controls, data level security. It's going to take all of those things in to the policy rules engine, and what it's going to do is then make decisions based upon that. On the back end, we're going to have logging and analytics. You can see a couple of different, bullet points here, but really that's what we're doing. Is the platform's going to bring in multiple pieces of context. It's going to look at the data that you're accessing. It's going to compare that to the policies that are defined. Should you be able to work with that? Should, we preventatively stop an SOD style violation? Or should we report on it? How do you want to handle it? What makes sense for your organization? Those are then all of the things that can kind of come into your control by being able to implement this particular platform. And we do this by really bringing in just, going beyond the traditional roles and privileges. And what we're going to do is bring in a policy-based access control. So the attributes or attribute-based access control and the business rules. So when we think about what those two pieces are, we'll break them down here for just a second. When we think about attributes, what are attributes? One, they're going to tell us about the user. They're going to tell us about how they're accessing the system. It's bits and pieces of information that mean things to us and can make us smarter. What they do is help define our risk by giving us ways to see and understand what risk model they may be coming from, who the user is, what type of data are they working with? What's the classification of the data? What's the time of day? What country are they coming? Where are they coming from? How are they accessing the system? All of those things are attributes. It's things that give us more information about that particular user and where and what they're doing. And we're going to look at the business rules, corporate policies, no expenses over X amount, no discounts over X amount, or percentages and those types of things. Governance, no access to PII outside of the corporate network, level 2, level 1, you define it. No transactions should be performed after hours. Why is that important? Do you want people accessing sensitive information at 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning? Probably not. Especially if you're working in an environment where they're all remote anyway. You want people accessing the system in their normal methods and actions, not outside of the norm. Typically your employees probably don't work at that time of night. If they do, great, but that's something that you can define within the business rules themselves. So when we have these two pieces working together, what it does is it really utilizes the hybrid role-based access control, and it puts together the attribute-based access control model. So the two work together as an authorization layer that enables rapid, wide-reaching change without the need to redesign the individual roles. Because what we want to do is leverage what you've done. We don't want to have to replace all of the roles that you've got out there. The authorization logic in RBAC is limited to static roles and permissions. So by adding in the attribute-based access controls, we're going to extend the authorization logic down to the field level, and considers dynamic context. It brings in those additional attributes to then make the decision. So with that hybrid model, what you're really, leveraging is you're going to take advantage of the role-based access controls that are static, role-based, transactional level. They grant the user access to do what they need to do inside of the application. They have to have those. But what we're going to do is layer on there through the attribute-based access controls, dynamic attribute-based and field level protection. So you're going to be able to have both of them working together in a very tight, nice solution that works within your SAP system. So a few examples before we jump into a quick demo here is aligning the SAP data masking to existing corporate data governance policies. Everybody's data masking policies are different. Some organizations are very adamant about it. Some are just starting. What are we going to do? How are we going to protect data? I've talked to organizations that really, let me just start with the national ID, social security number. Let's start there. That's all I want to start with. And then we'll worry about something else down the line. At least at that particular point, they're working through something. They have a data governance policy. Well, let's implement that and put that into the system. Restrict high risk transactions to secure environments only. And by that, what are high-risk transactions? Well, it's going to depend upon what you've implemented from SAP. You know, what's important to you. It could be a payroll transaction. It could be a vendor transaction, paying a vendor. Two very different transactions, but they both involve with money, you know. So obviously they're going to be a little bit more higher risk. So we want to limit them to location, certain hours, whitelisted IPs, those types of things. And also the cap on the financial risk exposure of SAP transactions. You know, you don't want POs being created and released, you know, if it's something outside of what your policies are. So those are just a few examples. So what I wanted to do here real quick is I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I am going to allow Rajesh to come in, and we're going to go through a little bit of a demo here. So I'm going to make Rajesh presenter here.
Thanks, Greg. Let me share my screen here. All right. I'm sharing my SAP screen. Please let me know when you can see it.
We can see it.
All right. Thanks, Greg. So here I have two users. One is SD user 1, who's going to be the business user that can change policies. And the second user is a normal user that can access certain data, but not sensitive information. So from an approach point of view, as Greg mentioned, this is an attribute-based access control approach, and it's driven by access policies. So in terms of the roles, these two users have exactly the same role. So if I go into the user profile and look at the profile that the user has, you can see that this user has SAP on. And similarly, this other user that I'm going to use also has a similar profile. And this is just to simplify the demo. We're not recommending assigning SAP all, but to show that the policies control the access restrictions, we've just simplified it by assigning SAP all profiles to the user. So now when the user tries to access different transactions, say, for example, the user tries to go into HR master data and tries to view personal data, for example. When this user goes in, this user has access to almost all the information within the transaction, such as social security number, date of birth, first name, last name, and so on. When the second user goes into the same transaction, even though the profiles are still the same from an SAP point of view, when this user goes in, you can see that this user does not have access to all the information within the transaction. For example, the last name, social security number, date of birth, and designation. This is just to show that even drop-downs can be masked. So we can configure the list of sensitive fields within the transaction in the Appsian security platform. And so we can change what fields we consider sensitive. And for some reason, if we say even the first name of the user is sensitive, then we can go into the platform and change the attribute to sensitive attribute by just adding this field into the list of sensitive fields that we have within the platform. So once I add that and save it, when this user goes back in, I would expect the first name to be masked as well. So now when this user goes into PA20 to view the personal data, you can see now the first name as well is masked now. So the policy actually looks into who the user is and where are they coming in from. Are they coming in from their normal access parameters, or are they coming in from outside of it? And also the data that the user is trying to view. So sensitivity of the data and the attributes of the user and the context of access all play in into the access restriction, and only the right data is allowed for the right user at the right time. So now, if we want to just say, I don't want the user to even go into the transaction when the user is coming in from outside of normal access parameters. In those cases, we can just go in and just block the user from going into the transaction. And in this case, the user is trying to display a sales order, and we block the user from even going into the sales order. And the way we do that is we are considering the access parameter of where the user is coming in from. And in this case, what we're using to restrict the user is the IP range. And this user is coming in from an IP range that's part of this restricted IP ranges. So when I specify this user and try to get the IP address, you can see that this user is coming in from 238, which is the last range here. So I'm going to change it to 237 so that the user is now outside of this restricted IP range. And so when the user goes back into VA03, the user actually is able to go into the transaction and view the sales document. As soon as I change this back and include that IP range in the deny range, now you can see that the policy kicks in and the user immediately is blocked. So that's how we can make sure that the access to the right data at the right time can be enforced during transaction evaluation immediately. So when the user switches from one network to the other, they can use that IP from which the SAP GUI or the app is being, POE app is being launched, and we can make sure that only the right data is being displayed to the user. And this can be extended to other scenarios such as approval use cases. Say, for example, if somebody is trying to approve a PO about a certain dollar value, which is normally restricted through the PO release strategy, but then we are now taking into account the access context as well. So even if the user is authorized to approve POs of large dollar values, because of the access restrictions that are tied to the context, we can make sure that only the right users are able to release it under the right context. So here, if you see, we have a release control using the dollar value. And so if somebody is trying to release a PO that is greater than $10,000, we stop the user. And similarly, we also have a rule that restricts the number of POs the user can release at a time within a particular window. So if the user tries to release the first one, the user is allowed. Similarly, the second one, the user is allowed. Now, when the user tries to release a third one, we immediately block the user. And so we can stop the user from releasing a number of POs within a particular time frame. And this particularly is useful when the ID is compromised and somebody else is trying to approve POs. So the same thing can be also applied to table browsing transactions when users don't have access to the transaction, say, for example, to view certain data within the transaction, such as, in this case, let's say, purchase order header. And when the user is trying to view that data from the table directly, we let the user view that information on the screen. And so the user has access to this information. But then when the user tries to download this information, we block that from happening. And so this kind of prevents the sensitive information from leaving the SAP system. So this is data exfiltration. And this can be applied at a level deeper as well or lower, where we can say, you can download certain information that's not sensitive, but then we will block out or filter out the sensitive rows from the table download. Say, for example, in this case, if I go into Material Master and try to display certain materials here, we can filter out sensitive information from being downloaded instead of just blocking everything. So in this case, what we have done is the rule restricts people from downloading finished goods, which is FERT, but they are allowed to download packing materials, VERP. So when the user tries to download, there is an information message that pops up and lets the user know that sensitive information is going to be restricted from being downloaded. And when the user acknowledges it and goes into the transaction, you can see that there's a pop-up for download. And so when the user tries to save it, the data gets downloaded. And now when I go back to the file here, you can see only one row is downloaded, which is of material type ERP, which is the packaging material. And the two finished goods have been filtered out, so the user is not able to download it. And we can use any column here to filter out the data, and it can be used to restrict sensitive material, sensitive customer info, or sensitive component within a BOM, and we can make sure only the materials that are not sensitive or the documents that are not sensitive are being downloaded by the user. The other scenario that I wanted to share is the SOD scenario that Greg was talking about. So if I go into two conflicting set of transactions that the user can execute, for example, creating a purchase order and trying to post a goods receipt against the same purchase order. So if I go in and pick a purchase order that's created by this user, I'm going to pick something created by this user that I'm logged in as. And when I do that, you can see there are a couple of POs here. So I'm just going to pick this one and try to post goods receipt against the PO that ends in 12. So when I go in and try to do goods receipt, and try to post the goods receipt, you can see immediately there is a block that stops the user from doing that. So that way we are able to block the user from being able to execute those two conflicting sets of transactions. The same would apply to a purchase order release as well. So if I go into a purchase order release transaction and try to release a PO that's not created by this user, for example, 03 is not created by this user. And so when I try to release it and save it, the document actually gets saved. But then when I switch over to a PO that's created by this user and try to release this PO, you can see that there is a message that blocks the user from being able to release that PO. So instead of blocking it at the transaction level, we go down to the document level and we see if that document for which the user is trying to post goods receipt or is trying to release is the same one that's created by the user, then we block it. If not, it's actually not an SOD, right? And so we let the transaction proceed, and we also filter out the false positives and only focus on the actual SODs that happen. And because we are an add-on from a solution point of view, we are installed as an add-on on top of the SAP ERP system. We work the same way on both Fiori as well as ECC. And this is an S4 system, and I'm again using two users that have the same permissions. And so if I run a transaction here from the first user, so this is a normal user that has no access to sensitive information. You can see that this user does not see certain information within the transaction, such as the street address, the telephone communication information is all masked for this user. Whereas if I go to this other user who's a super user and try to run the same transaction from this app, I'm going to pick the same business partner, and you can see that this user actually has access to the same transaction, but the information being displayed is different. And this user can actually view the street address and also the telephone number. And the restriction that we have here for the policy is a date range. So if the user is trying to access sensitive information within a particular date range, we then block it. And you can see in this case, we're using deny date, and the range ends around May 5th. So I'm going to change this to the 5th of April. So now the user is no longer accessing the data within the deny range and should be allowed access. So when the user goes back in and tries to access the transaction, you can see that the user now has access to the communication as well as the address. So the add-on works similarly on both S4HANA and on ERP, and same on, I used a classic transaction here, but if we go back to a FIOD transaction, it would work the same way. So the add-on has no restriction in terms of what UI is being used or what kind of ABAP engine is being used to run the application. So it can be ERP, it can be CRM, SRM. As long as it's an ABAP engine, we will be able to lock access to the data under certain context. So that's from an access control point of view, and I was just going to go into the analytics here. So this is a dashboard, and I'm using Splunk right now, and we have our own Appsian 360 for the analytics as well. So I'm going to go into the usage analytics here and show the different kinds of reports that we can generate, different kinds of information that we can capture during transaction runs. Here you can see the most frequently run transactions by users, by count, and also by IP ranges, and also the access status for those different transactions. And we also have a visual of where these users are coming in from. And here you can see how transactions are being allowed and how they're being denied. And also it can be segregated by users, sensitive transactions, or by user types such as employees or contractors, and also by sensitivity of the data within the transaction. In this case, if somebody has full access to a certain transaction, they are viewing sensitive information within the transaction. And if somebody has limited access, it means that they are able to view the transactional data, but not sensitive information within the transaction. And also, if we go down, you can see the trends by user groups and also by IP ranges and by access areas. And if I go down all the way, you can see that we can track profiles that are such high privileged profiles, such as SAP All, that's being used to change documents and fields within the documents. And in some cases, we can also capture the values within the transactions or the fields that are being changed. I'm going back to the dashboard. And I'm going to go into the business risk analytics. So this is tailored more towards the business process owners. And so it gives information from a process area point of view and also from an allowed denied transaction point of view. Also, you can see any critical business process within the system. And in this case, master data changes. So if somebody's changing vendor master or material master business partners in the system, who's changing it, and if it's being changed frequently, then we can go in and see why that's happening within the system. And similarly, pricing or discount changes, any financial data changes within the system can be captured, and we can monitor or see how many times they are being changed, who's changing it, what field within that particular transaction is being changed, and things like that. And similarly, if somebody's overriding payment terms for business partners, these are just examples of critical business transactions that we want to track, and it can be anything that needs to be tracked from a business point of view. And again, if somebody's trying to run a background job for a transaction for which they don't have access directly, then we can use the SM35 logs to see how those batch jobs are being submitted by the different users, and we control access to that as well. And finally, we have the compliance risk analytics, where we capture different kinds of reports or information that are of interest to the compliance teams or auditors. So in this case, privileged users, how are they accessing the system? Are they accessing or executing critical transactions within the system? And also, if critical transactions are being executed by non-privileged users, if we want to monitor that, we can do that as well, and where those users are coming in from, and also the access status both by transactions as well as by the user IDs as well. And here is sensitive information about segregation of duty transactions. So here we see the example of purchase order being created and somebody trying to post goods receipt, and we go down to the document. So we know exactly what documents were involved in the goods receipt and the PO creation. And so we don't have to dig through the SOD rules and the transaction process to see what violation happened and who did it. So that way we can capture that in real time when the transactions are being executed. And additional information about any high-risk transactions that are being run within the system can also be captured, and we can control access based on those transactions as well. So that's from the analytics part. I just wanted to stop there and hand it over back to Ryan.
All right, perfect, Rajesh. Thank you. I am going to grab the screen back here real quick. So as you can see, some of the things that we wanted to cover off on here just to wrap up is this is a native solution to your SAP system. So it really enables a rapid implementation, has a negligible performance impact. And that's one of the things that we have to go through from a certification of being an SAP partner, which really allows for the streamlined maintenance and updates of the product as well. So some of the key points to take home before we hit some of the questions that have been asked today is in today's dynamic environment, context determines risk, and the context continually changes. So it's understanding that you need to be able to really control that the best you possibly can. And your risk exposure will grow exponentially if you rely solely on static controls through the digital transformation initiatives. So what you're trying to do is strike a balance between the seamless business processes and strong security of dynamic controls that are essential. So your ERP data is the crown jewels. Incorporating data-centric security will help you further minimize your risk exposure. And finally, incorporating an attribute-based authorization layer in SAP will help you gain the agility needed to quickly address these changing requirements. So I'm sure that you might have some questions from the presentation that we've gone through today. So I'm actually going to bring in Ryan to ask some of those questions of Rajesh and I. Ryan?
Sure thing. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Rajesh. All right, we have a few questions here. One of them is, what is the effort involved in the policy lifecycle management for these ABAC policies?
Sure. So the ABAC policies are written into the system based on the fields that need to be controlled and the transactions that need to be monitored. So once they are created by the admins or the super users within the system, the maintenance for those transactions or for those policies are very less, and the number of people that are needed from a maintenance point of view is in general terms, right? In a normal scenario, we've had like one basis person, one from super user group, and one technical person, functional. So that's typically how the Center of Excellence group for the Appsian policies are established within the customer's landscape. And after the initial implementation, we train the COE to continue with any tweaks that need to be done to the policies or to scale policies to different fields or transactions that need to be monitored.
Great. Okay. Another one here is, does the location-based functionality work if users are accessing SAP through a VPN?
Yeah. So in order for the location to be used by the policy, what we are looking for is the IP address range. So if the CIDR ranges are established based on the network from which the users are trying to log in from, we should be able to pick the SAP GUI is IP address or the gateway server from which SAP GUI is being launched. And we can use that to make sure that the regional enforcement that needs to be made in terms of data masking can be done through those CIDR ranges.
Great. Okay. And then I've got another one here. What's the performance impact, the storage requirement for the logs?
Okay. So in terms of performance, as Greg mentioned, we are an SAP certified solution. And so the performance overhead that we can add to our transaction is around, it should be less than 200 milliseconds. So all our transaction performance fall within that benchmark. And in terms of, sorry, what was the other one, Ryan?
Come back to storage requirements of the logs.
Okay, got it. Got it. So we don't have to have any of the standard trace logs or standard STAD logs turned on. All of the logs that we capture are written into the Appsian policies or platform tables. And so we pick that up and we send it over to the Splunk system. So the access storage within the ERP system can be archived every month or 3 weeks whenever the customer runs those archive jobs. That should still be fine. And everything is then sent over to the Splunk or the A360 system that's outside of SAP. And so that can hold a large amount of data that can be, that can hold almost 1 year's worth of data, and we can send specifications for those servers. Those are outside of SAP app servers.
Fantastic. All right, that wraps it up. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for your attendance on the webinar today. We appreciate you taking your afternoon or your morning to spend time with us here at Appsian. And with that, I'd like to wrap up and hopefully see you on a future webinar. Just a reminder, if you do have any additional questions after the session today, you can always email us at info@appsian.com. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.